This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Geoff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world.
Nic Cheeseman, Professor of Democracy at the University of Birmingham. Welcome to Human Coined.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You know how many times I've sent you a podcast invitation at the bottom of a LinkedIn post that you made? You may not have seen them, but I've been wanting to do this for a while because you're doing very important work at a time where the world really needs it. So why don't you start by telling us a bit about, we're going to talk about some of your publications, but what is your mission? What are you doing on a day-to-day basis when it comes to democracy?
Well, hopefully we're generating research which helps people to understand a few really important things, right? One is why democracy is in decline. Globally, we know we've had about 20 years of democratic decline. So this isn't a blip. This isn't an aberration. This is the new normal, sadly. Two, we're trying to then connect that, right, with civil society groups, policymakers, activists, in terms of, given what we know about what's happening, what are then going to be the most effective strategies? And obviously, it's really important to try and make sure that the ways we respond have this evidence base, right? That we are trying to connect the great energy around the world to what we know about what is most likely to be successful. And then three, really trying to think about, okay, once we've got those new political systems that perhaps have bounced back and have managed to resist authoritarianism, what does it then actually take to build more stable, strong, inclusive, effective systems for the future? We kind of encapsulate a lot of that under the kind of heading of democratic resilience. So making democracies more resilient to the threat of authoritarianism, but also really importantly, recognizing that this is not just about turning the clock back to the early 1990s and going back to a time when democracy was on top, because those democracies had flaws which led us to where we are now. So it's also about having to transform democracy in new ways that make it more legitimate, more grounded, that generate more effective responses. So we're not just kind of turning back the clock, we're actually future-proofing democracy and building something that's stronger for the next 20, 30 years.
And I started my career in the 1990s, late 1990s, when democracy was on the upswing. And, we thought that was the prevalent model. Why is democracy in decline? I certainly have my thoughts about that, and I know you talk about that in your book, but just in general, what are your main observations on why democracy is currently in decline?
Well, my favorite line on this, and maybe I'll start there, is that we have to beware what I call the temporal fallacy. And the temporal fallacy is just that, sometimes it's tempting to think that because all this stuff is happening at the same time, it's happening for the same reason, right? We've got all these countries around the world moving towards authoritarianism. There must be a common reason. And I don't think there necessarily is. I think in lots of different regions, the driving force is different. So if we were to look at Europe and North America, for example, we've had people like Stephen Nowitzki, Ziblatt and others write great books about, the loss of toleration in US politics and political polarization. We have people talking about everything from, the lack of class mobility and the frustration of people not being able to live better lives or the same lives as their parents, to the impacts of globalization and so on. And that's one set potentially of answers, but that set of answers isn't necessarily going to apply, for example, to sub-Saharan Africa, where we don't see the rise of right-wing populists, and that isn't the dynamic that's actually driving it. If you look at Africa, we have, for example, a set of countries in West Africa that have suffered coups, and then a set of countries where existing leaders have actually eroded checks and balances on their power. So not opportunist outsider candidates as opposition candidates challenging governments and then taking power and then backsliding, but existing incumbent leaders weakening the checks and balances of them. And there, I think the root causes of that are very different. So what is the root cause of some of those coups, for example? Probably a history of chronic instability, the inability of the government to actually govern and secure its own territory, combined with the fact that a lot of those leaders had actually reneged on democratic principles themselves. So they'd kind of undermine their own democratic credentials. It's a bit like, standing on the plank and sawing the plank off and cutting yourself into the water. You've got one set of democratic credentials polls, you're not really delivering performance, so you don't have performance legitimacy, and then you start undermining your democratic legitimacy, what do you have left? Why would citizens go out and protest for you? And that then creates the conditions under which you can legitimate military coups. So I think one of the things we need to think about is that perhaps we have multiple different pathways towards authoritarianism happening in different places at different times. The one common thing that I think we can now point to that is perhaps something that stretches across all of this is the rise of what we might call the kind of illiberal international, right? The fact that we now see more effective, aggressive, authoritarian networks connecting, authoritarian leaders and bankers and big shots and money men in one country with, allied parties and leaders in another. And that process of building that network makes authoritarian movements stronger in countries where maybe they would otherwise be weaker. It helps to sustain authoritarian parties when they're out of power and enable them to get back into power. It also can involve actually preventing people being prosecuted. We've seen, for example, Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, appealing to Donald Trump to use his leverage to push Brazil to try and get the Brazilian government to stop the prosecution of Bolsonaro, who, of course, along with other officials, is accused effectively of plotting a coup and to assassinate senior political figures in Brazil. So all of these different kind of networks and processes are perhaps making it easier to sustain authoritarianism than would have been the case 10 years, 20 years ago. And that might be one of the common factors at the international level. But as I say, the domestic level, I think there's a lot of variation.
And in your book, The Myth of Democratic Resilience, you talk about the authoritarian spiral, right?
Yeah, and I think this is something we have to be careful about. That, one of the things that people have been getting hopeful about in the last few years is that we might see democratic U-turns. So Brazil, you have the period of instability under Bolsonaro, but you bounce back and he's removed from power. Poland, we see a similar process. Bangladesh, of course, we saw an authoritarian regime removed by mass protest led by students. There are other cases around the world. Zambia, removed President Lungu through elections. And these sort of moments of kind of democratic rebirth are celebrated. What we try to point out in the piece on the myth of democratic resilience is we've got to be careful not to over-celebrate. Because when we see that victory of democratic forces, one of the things that we often forget is that some of those authoritarian practices and institutions are actually, embedded within the state during the period of authoritarian rule and are very difficult to remove. So a good example, would be somewhere like Poland. If you start to get a situation under authoritarian rule where a lot of the judiciary become, co-authoritarians or supportive of authoritarian rule, where a lot of the heads of a lot of the media stations are, and so on, then when you get power as a democratic government and you want to reform the country, you've got a really difficult decision. And the difficult decision is, do you follow due process, which might involve investigations, hearings, tribunals? It might take years with the appeals process. Or do you simply sack people? And it's tempting to sack people, right? But if you sack people, then you yourself are actually breaking due process and weakening the institution by doing so. You're also potentially creating a precedent that the old authoritarian power, when they take power again in the future, and they may win a future election, will actually turn around and say, well, hey, you guys sacked people on the spot because you said they weren't right for your government, so why can't we? So there's a real risk that if you act too quickly and you don't follow the processes in the Constitution and the law, you actually exacerbate the problem that you're trying to solve. Of course, if you don't do that, you leave people in place who can then veto your reforms. You leave potentially judges and others in place who can prevent you from actually redemocratizing. And one of the, the punchline to this, unfortunately, is that in a lot of countries where we've seen democratic forces win recent elections, if you look at opinion polls, and indeed, if you look at recent elections in those countries, authoritarian leaders or the sort of inheritors of those in authoritarian movements are either ahead or pretty much neck and neck. And so one of the things we're trying to appeal to people for in that piece is don't think just because you've had this victory that you've won the war, right? This was one battle in a long running campaign. And you may well find that you actually have an authoritarian government in power next time. And the other thing in that vein that might be worth people keeping in mind is that it's sometimes the second time the authoritarian power gets or force or party or leader gets to power that we see them actually seemingly have a more concerted plan. So think of Orban in Hungary, think of Trump in the United States. The second iteration of the leader seems to come with a much more coherent, focused plan that has much bigger significant implications for the stability of democracy moving forwards. And so one of the things we might need to really think about is perhaps we haven't actually seen the biggest threat to democracy in Brazil, Poland, etc. Perhaps that is to come.
Hmm. And in the case of Hungary, I think the concern there is that it's taking, like you said, Poland may be reversible because the authoritarianism was not as entrenched, but Hungary, it started to look like it may be very hard to reverse, partly because of the control of the judiciary, for example. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think one of the things we might want to keep in mind, and this is relevant for people who might be concerned about the future prospects of the United States and other countries, is like, what are the moments when the system can't self-correct, right? What are the moments when it's very hard to get the people who are abusing the rule of law out? And I think there are certain key stages, and you just touched on one there. I completely agree. When they take control of the judiciary, so the judiciary can no longer protect the Constitution effectively, that's a critical moment. Another critical moment, I think, is, control of the Electoral Commission. One of the things that was interesting to me, I was in Turkey not long ago talking to people, and there was a perception that was interesting to me that quite a lot of people felt that, the Electoral Commission would announce something, pretty close to the actual results of the election, that the control and the manipulation was elsewhere in the system, that the Electoral Commission wasn't necessarily captured and it wasn't faking the results for Erdogan. Now, that's really interesting to me because I think, that's to me one of the critical, moments. If you get an Electoral Commission that will announce the results as the votes are cast, you
Yeah.
still have a chance as an opposition, right? Because if you manage to get overwhelming turnout, if you galvanize people, if you form that opposition coalition, if the government is hit by economic decline and scandals at the same time, all of a sudden you can have an election result that surprises the government and you get the opportunity to remove the government from power. But as soon as the Electoral Commission is essentially controlled, as it is, in a number of countries that I
Hmm.
work in, for
Hmm.
example, in sub-Saharan Africa, but not just in Africa, in a number of countries in parts of Asia, a number of post-Soviet countries as well. When that happens, doesn't really matter necessarily how well the opposition performs. They might not be allowed to win. And one of the things that I've seen, in a lot of countries I work on is that essentially, if you're an opposition party, you kind of need to win big to be allowed to win. But if you win by
Right.
2% of the vote, if you see an opposition party ahead by a few percent in the polls, by general default is they're probably going to lose the election because the advantages of incumbency that the ruling party has and the ability to sort of manipulate small numbers mean that it can be quite easy for the government and the Electoral Commission, if they're working together, to reverse that. Whereas when you get an opposition that's 5%, 10%, 15% ahead, all
Mhm.
of a sudden those numbers become much more difficult to hide and mask. So yeah, I think there's a really interesting question there. And I think on a number of those indicators, Hungary is getting to a point where it's really difficult to see the opposition winning. But I know in the last couple of years, people who are activists and people who are working there have seen more signs for hope. So maybe, there's still an opportunity there in Hungary. But as you say, as you move further along that path, the weaker the opportunity to actually build back is, and the more exceptional the effort by the opposition is going to have to be to achieve it.
I'm pausing only because I have so many questions in my head that I want to ask, and I've got all these prepared questions for you too. So I'm trying to figure out what to ask next. Um, I, let's just go back for a second to this issue of the key stages and the point of, and what I would sort of call the point of no return for democracy in terms of authoritarianism. Obviously, what's happening now in the United States is deeply concerning to the world. It's certainly concerning to us here in Canada, where we're obviously the neighbors of a country that is no longer considered a free country in terms of Freedom House ratings. Let's just talk for a moment from the same book about future proofing. You talked about Germany and Norway, but what should countries like Canada and others be doing to future-proof their democracy?
I think there's maybe three
And the
things
UK, of course.
where future proofing is concerned. So one of the things we talk about is, there are some countries that have looked ahead and said, what are we going to do? What's going to be the situation if the far right were able to take power? is our constitution or our rules, are the things we hold most dear, institutionalized enough that they would survive? And if the answer is no, they've looked at ways of protecting against that. So, for example, if you have unclear rules on security of tenure for judges, or if you have unclear rules on whether judges can be forced to retire and so on, making sure that they're clarified, putting them in the constitution, increasing the threshold to change those things can be ways of protecting that in case you get a non-democratic government in power. So they're essentially, it's about institutionalizing the things that matter most for your political system and making sure that you've done that. In the UK, where of course, we notoriously don't have the kind of high profile set of constitutional documents that you would have in perhaps Germany or the United States, you would think that would be one of the things that you would, be most keen to do. But instead, our politicians at the minute are spending all of their time fighting a zero sum, no winners game on immigration, rather than actually dealing with some of the biggest challenges we probably face in terms of sustaining our own democracy. So
And
that's
Nick,
one.
on that, sorry, and on that front, though, I didn't mean to interrupt you. We can come back to the other points, but in that sense, I wanted to ask you whether you feel that our leaders today and our parliamentarians today are, in a sense, losing our democracies, not serving our democracies by not consciously future-proofing those democracies.
I think there is a scandalous complacency, an unimaginable scandalous complacency in many countries in the world about the lack, people do not seem to understand the threat. They do not seem to understand the implications of the last 20 years of world politics. They do not seem to understand the significance for the stability and future of democracy if they don't take some of the actions that we're talking about today. And I see this in multiple ways. I mean, one is that I see a lot of the crises we have in the world today as being driven by authoritarian states, whether that's Russia's invasion of Ukraine,
Yep.
whether it's civil war and conflict in countries that is driving refugees and migration. A lot of the main problems we have, whether we think about cyber attacks, right, from Russia, from Iran, from wherever, on other countries, a lot of these challenges are driven predominantly by authoritarian states. And that is not a coincidence. It is partly because they are authoritarian states. So we should be seeing authoritarianism as a security risk. We should be understanding that it makes us less safe. We should be understanding that a world that has gone or from majority democratic to majority authoritarian, and in which authoritarianism is growing and authoritarian states are becoming better networked and emboldened, that makes us less safe. That makes us less safe even within the European Union, where we're in a team of other fairly democratic states. That makes us less safe. It certainly makes you less safe if you're an isolated democratic country in an authoritarian neighborhood, as some countries around the world find themselves. But we don't treat that as a security problem. So the way we tend to deal with our security problems is say, okay, let's keep our alliances with authoritarian states. We need supporters, we need allies in a world of increasing power politics and, of course, multipolarity. There are many different countries around the world now that, can claim to be, world powers. In, rising countries like India and so on, China, the United States hegemony is obviously gone. And in that moment, I think our response, a lot of the response of Western states has been to say, let's actually tolerate more authoritarianism in countries that could be our partners so we don't alienate them. So we don't stand up for free and fair elections. We don't stand up for human rights. We don't stand up for democracy because we think that those things will alienate countries and they'll push them more towards Russia or United Arab Emirates or China or whoever it is. And we think that down the line, this is going to save us because we've got a set of allies who will be on our side. And
So,
what I
like,
think
one example of that, sorry to interrupt again, but so one example of that would be our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, going down to the United States and understandably doesn't want to alienate him. We've got lots of reasons why we don't want to alienate the President of the United States, and telling him that he's a transformational president, right? We cannot openly, our government cannot openly condemn what is happening in the United States because we are on the firing line. When it comes to tariffs, when it comes to the threat that Trump was talking about, would that be a good example of the kind of thing you're referring to?
Yeah, I think it is. But I also think that what's interesting is that we start to see, this happening with countries that are much less significant, right? So it's not just that Western states, Canada, UK, France, Germany, are starting to pull their punches with respect to the United States. And our government in the UK has done the same, right? It wanted to be
Yes.
basically the European
Yes.
country that got the privileged deal with the
Yes.
United States. But we're also
Yes.
doing that with other countries that are much less significant to us economically, right? So the United States can have a massive effect on your economy. But we're also making those similar trade-offs, for example, to countries in West Africa where Wagner were involved in Russian, was involved, Russia was involved, Russian forces were involved perhaps through Wagner and Africa Corps as it then became, in terms of, supporting coup leaders. And there was a concern that, actually coming out and condemning things and speaking too strongly against authoritarian trends within countries would encourage them to go to Russia. And we could see parts of Africa tilting and becoming alliance partners of Russia rather than ours. So I think we muted our criticism in a lot of those countries, both in some of the coup countries, but also some of the countries adjacent to the coup countries where we worried about this trend. And what really worries me about that is that these are not countries that are economically massive players. They're not countries that have the capacity to really inflict pain on us if we don't play ball. They're countries that we're trying to keep online because we think we're back in some kind of Cold War power play and we need our allies and they need their allies. And I think there's two fundamental flaws to that. I mean, one, I think, the Cold War period was desperately problematic and challenging for people around the world who got caught up in these proxy battles. And we know the consequences of sacrificing democracy, and it's the abuse of thousands and millions of people in states around the world. But the second thing is that I don't think those countries are going to be reliable allies. I think those countries are not going to break with us when push comes to shove. So I think we're kind of building false alliances with countries that, pretend to be willing to support us, but have no actual vested interest in necessarily going with us if it comes down to a global conflict. And so I'm not sure that we're actually securing our long-term future because we don't actually have much in common with a lot of these countries in
No.
terms of either their domestic policy or their foreign policy. To me, a much more effective way of building long-term stability would be to foster and encourage and support those people in those countries that are trying to build democratic systems so that we get democratic states, which are then natural allies to us because they are also democracies and have similar goals. And that's a much more stronger foundation for long-term alliance building. The system we have at the minute, I worry, undermines democracy and undermines our own security longer term.
So let's go back to the future proofing. I interrupted you, but you had two more key points on that you wanted to mention.
Well, one is obviously that we need to recognize that some of the grievances against democracy are legitimate, right?
That's
We
right.
might not like the
That's right.
populist expression
Yeah.
and the racism and the hostility to immigrants that has come with some of that in parts of the Western world, but the complaint is often legitimate. We have very high levels of inequality. We have young people who don't see the same economic opportunities as previous generations, people who do struggle to get on the housing market. A lot of the economic concerns are legitimate, and we do have governments that don't always seem to have particularly effective responses. So I think unless we actually tackle that seriously and start to find ways that we can actually deliver economically, we are going to continue to have these challenges no matter how well we design our democracy. So I think the second thing we need to do is actually respond to some of those grievances much more effectively and honestly than we have so far. And then the third thing is I think we have to find a way to rebrand democracy, right? Democracy is not sexy. I, began and cut my teeth, like you did, right? At a time when democracy was ascendant,
Yeah.
where to be pro-democratic in much of the world was to be a revolutionary, to be a freedom fighter, to be fighting the one-party state, to be
Yeah.
building a new system. And then we got to a situation where so many countries were democratic, or at least claimed to be democratic when they probably weren't, that, democracy became commonplace, boring, the status quo, and perhaps, the military juntas with the cool sunglasses and the great looking uniforms all of a sudden look more edgy, more interesting, more like they are the revolutionaries of today. And that has captured the imagination in a way that democratic leadership has not. And I think we need to be able to fight back. It's not as simplistic as saying, Biden's charisma versus Trump or Keir Starmer's versus Farage in the UK, but we need to find a way of actually having a language that expresses why what we care about is important, that actually resonates with people. And I worry at the minute that we're losing that kind of PR game, partly because of disinformation, but partly because a lot of the time, far right groups and right wing groups are better at using social media, more effective at using things like TikTok, and have a better understanding of how to get ideas to resonate with people. And I think those of us who want to campaign and support democracy need to do more to find messages and narratives that compete with those. So those three things I think are really important. And I think if we don't do any one of those three things, sadly, the world will keep getting more authoritarian.
And on point number two, I think that we can acknowledge the failure of the concept of American electoral democracy, right? Which was very much, I think, ascendant when democracy was in its ascendance. The idea was we don't need to have a social democracy where those issues of inclusiveness and that social compact exists. We're just going to go through the elections process. Having said that, if the failure of electoral democracy is leading to people joining the far right and saying, well, they're disillusioned, there's grievances against democracy, isn't that partly because we've lost the concept of social democracy, which was very much a concept that was owned by the left?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I think one of the challenges for the left is how do you position yourself
What
if the
left?
right
It's
grabs the
gone.
flag?
Doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah,
It's been
that's
wiped
the
out.
challenge, right? And you're left without a base. And the left has always, historically, for good reason, been scared of picking up the flag and waving it. But I remember hearing a really good talk by, I don't know if you've heard the sort of UK sort of folk lefty musician Billy Bragg, but I remember him giving a talk. It was actually at the Oxford Union a very long time ago about the need for those on the left to capture the flag and to have a positive nationalist message that would proclaim as you say, certain ideals, maybe about equality, about social democracy, but merge them with, historical understandings of where their country had come from, but turn those into something that was progressive and could be an inclusive message. Otherwise, he made the argument that we will cede the use of the flag to the right. We will make it look like it is only the right that can stand up for the country. And I think he was right, at that point. Nobody actually really took him up on the left and did that. And what do we have today in the UK? We have people putting up English flags all over the place, apparently as a sort of message that seems to go beyond just national pride, but is about symbolizing perhaps migrants out, perhaps white power. It's unclear. The movement is only just, happening now. So we'll take some time, I guess, to evaluate it. But I think it demonstrates his point that we were ineffective at doing that. But yeah, I think you're also right that, there's a really interesting question here fundamentally about to what extent is inequality compatible with democracy? And do you get to points where not necessarily all forms of inequality, but certain forms of inequality actually start to undermine the democratic project? And one of the things I think that will be interesting to look at maybe in 5-10 years is did the countries that had a better deal, that did a better deal on building a political consensus on that kind of social democracy and on reducing the level of inequality? And perhaps we might think here about countries like Sweden, etc., Denmark, did those countries fare better through this democratic crisis than those countries that said, yeah, let's have the electoral democracy without actually having social democracy? It's worth reminding people, if you go back to Tocqueville, who of course wrote, Democracy in America, the classic text a long time ago, very early on at the very beginning of American democracy, coming from France and fearing democracy and going to America and trying to understand how you could do democracy and make it work as an aristocrat, as somebody who didn't necessarily believe in democracy. One of the things that he thought was fundamental about enabling things to work in the US context was a form of equality, was actually that, you actually would be able to generate a situation where there would be a degree of social equality. So, moving away from that is moving away from some of the foundational ideas that people had about what would make it work. And of course, the founding fathers themselves, you could see from their conversations, were very worried about the idea that you could go into an election where one man could afford to buy somebody else due to his poverty and his wealth. We're now seeing Elon Musk going into tight election races, offering vast amounts of money for people who, sign up to do things that seem to be in favor of one candidate. So I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that we've moved into a very dangerous kind of social context, given what some of our foundational political thinkers thought about the importance of social equality to democracy.
Hmm. And going back to point 3 in terms of the future proofing, you mentioned rebranding democracy, and I think partly the issue is how you build the case for democracy. And I guess I don't have because I don't work on the issue of democracy full time. I work more on public financial management, but I guess there's a couple of observations I have, which is that it seems like one of the big cases for democracy should be lower levels of corruption, state corruption. I'm hoping, and I haven't seen the evidence. Hopefully you have that countries that are that are democracies, it's less likely that the leaders are stealing from their own population. Less likely to be a kleptocracy. I'm not sure if that's the case in all parts of the world, but that would be one assumption. What are your thoughts on that before I move on to assumption number 2?
Yes, a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, broadly speaking, that is true in the sense that if you look at people can do that if they're listening to us on their phones or on laptops. They can go to the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. They can look at the index for the last couple of years. You'll find that most of the top 10 countries there are democracies, and you'll find that most of the top 10 most corrupt countries there are authoritarian. So there's certainly a bit of evidence, to back that up. But I think it's also obviously a little bit more complicated than that. My sense
Of
is that,
course.
particularly high quality democracies do tend to have that lower level of corruption. There's also, though, of course, countries around the world where we see kind of the badge of democracy being used, but elections are heavily manipulated. So
Sure.
the countries that we talk about in How to Rig an Election, and in a lot of
Yes.
those countries, we actually see fairly high levels of corruption. And I think this is one of the problems, right? The fact that democracy has been applied to all of these different countries around the world because they hold elections and because they claim to be democracies, and some of them have democracy in the title of the country and in the title of the ruling party, right? Think about the Democratic Republic of Congo or whatever it
Sure.
is.
Sure.
That we get this process where people say, well, democracy hasn't actually delivered here. And I think the correct response to that, in a sense, is, well, democracy was never actually tried, right? What we were doing was not really democracy. It was the facade of democracy. I mean, we call it Potemkin democracy in the book, right?
Right.
You've built the shell of democracy, but everything about the system is not actually being run in a democratic way. And so democracy starts to get a bad name, including being related to corruption, election rigging, ethnic tensions and so on, partly because the political elites who are involved in those systems are not actually following any kinds of democratic norms and values. So yes, democracy tends to perform better, but the situation is obviously much more complicated than that. I think the one thing that's also important to say is that accusation of corruption is something that is very resonant among societies, even in governments that are relatively non-corrupt. So if you look around the world, there are governments that haven't had that high levels of corruption, have had some scandals, and there is corruption in almost all systems, right? We just have to say that most systems have a degree of corruption. It's very hard to have a system that is corruption free. So if you look at most countries around the world, there were procurement scams around the COVID-19 period because orders were rushed through, procurement regulations and requirements were
Yes.
relaxed. People
Absolutely.
took advantage all over the world in democracies and authoritarian states. What's really interesting is how central those corruption accusations are to the rise of populists. Right? It's almost inherent to the populist critique that the state is corrupt, that it is rotten, that is dysfunctional, and that is corrupt. Whether it's drain the swamp, whether it's accusations of corruption against the political elite, there's almost an inherent component of that populist movement that is arguing that everybody in power is implicated in a corrupt model that is against the interests of ordinary people. And of course, that kind of has to be that way for populists, because the populist wants to argue that the only person that can save us is the outsider, is the person who's not in the system, because everyone in the system is compromised. So only an outsider can do it. So only Donald Trump, as the outsider, if we go back before the first election, could save us from, Hillary Clinton and other elites. Only, the Maloney or only Farage or only Le Pen. That's the kind of pitch, right? That we are the only ones who can save you because we're outside the system, and therefore we're genuinely going to be a fresh brush to clean everything up.
I
And
guess
so
that
it's
also.
really,
Sorry, I was
sorry.
just gonna. No, I was just gonna say. I guess that answers my next question, which is why countries, people are willing to tolerate corruption in certain countries. Like, why would you tolerate, if you're a Trump voter, why would you tolerate Trump when when there's so much evidence around his corruption? Why would you tolerate that with Putin, although you wouldn't have much of a choice? Why would you tolerate that with Orban? And the Christian nationalism seems to be the kind of tying thread there, right? That somehow, if you are espousing those nationalist values, then people that's my theory, which is that people are willing to look the other way. I'm sure you could explain it a bit more sophisticated way than that.
It's tricky because, not living in the US and not seeing it on a daily basis, it's hard to pick it up. I think you're right about, sort of Christian nationalism. What I'm not sure about is whether people use that to excuse a preference they feel for other reasons, or whether that's the driving force. In other words, do people go to some of that language because they think it justifies and explains their decision to back Trump, but they would have backed him for other reasons? Or is it actually the reason why they're invested in this project in the first place? My sense is that, there is a little bit of a sense everywhere, right? That if it's your person in power and you think you're benefiting from what they're doing, that you might be less willing to sanction them and criticize them for being corrupt. And we think this, we think that's, one of the logics that might play out in some African states, where if it's a winner takes all game, and I know that someone else's ethnic leader takes power, they get the resources and corruption benefits. And when my guy takes power, my community gets it. And I feel like, well, that's the game. That's how we play the game. It's winner takes all. And if my guy's not there, it's their guy. So although I know he's corrupt, I'm going to back him because I'm benefiting from the corruption. But also I'm terrified that if I don't back him and the other side win, all of a sudden all the economic opportunities shift. So, maybe partly what we're seeing here is a little bit of that as well in the United States, that these are people who believe that they are going to benefit from Trump, and therefore they're willing to compromise on the cleanness of government, the accountability and inclusiveness of government, in order to get those personal benefits that they're assuming are coming to them, as well as perhaps, I think, being bound up in certain information cycles. So, I wonder, and this is something I wonder in many countries around the world, Putin, you mentioned, I would say Zimbabwe in rural areas, United States, how much, if you're a hardcore Trump supporter and you're tending to watch Fox News, how much are you hearing about the corruption versus the other stuff? What's the balance of that in your news cycle?
Sure.
And to what
Sure.
extent do we have people who are mainly consuming news, let's say on X or even Truth Social or whatever else it is,
Right.
and are basically getting reinforced a positive picture, and are therefore discounting some of the things that are coming out on that basis? And there might be a combination of all these three things that we've talked about: the kind of Christian nationalism on the one hand, that I actually think I'm going to potentially benefit from this, so I'm going to let it go, and then the news, what you're actually getting in terms of the information. Those three things together could be potentially quite a powerful lock. But it's also an important thing to remind ourselves then that we've also, in a sense, kind of failed, right? We failed as Democrats, to persuade people to invest in the concept of democracy, full stop, right? People are willing to trade democracy off and accountability and corruption against, other goals. And that, in a sense, says that, we've lost one of the key games that we need to, battles that we need to win, which is establishing the legitimacy of the rules of the game. And that's what scares me the most in some ways in the United States, because, what we're saying now about corruption could be true about other forms of the abuse of power, from the deployment of state forces illegitimately, which of course has been a big issue recently, all the way through to potential attempts to manipulate elections to bring in a successor who's an ally. And if you've got supporters who are willing to sanction and willing to accept that and willing to support that, that significantly reduces the costs to you, of doing it. And that's what worries me, going into the next US elections. Who are the people in the Republican Party and movement that would actually stand up and resist? And at the minute, it seems like they're vanishingly few.
And if we look at Canada, there's a journalist here, prominent pundit by the name of Andrew Coyne, who wrote a book called The Crisis in Canadian Democracy. And he argues that Canada's democratic institutions are in trouble because of how much power has become centralized in the Prime Minister's office. He thinks Parliament's role has diminished due to strict party discipline, and that stopped the MPs from acting independently. I think, there's a couple of other issues in Canada. One of them is that the fact that our constitution is so difficult to amend that it's really stopped it's really stopped us from renewing our democracy, from strengthening our democracy. For example, like the UK, we have an appointed upper chamber. It would be very, very difficult constitutionally to change that. I think also the electoral system means that we have a form of state capture at the federal level where we really have the alternation between two parties. And I don't think that when you have two parties running the country, I mean, yes, we have third and fourth parties in parliament, but when you have two countries running the country, I think what ends up happening is that they lose track of what's really important for a resilient democracy, and the focus tends to be more on how they can win the next election and get ahead. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a really good point. I was talking to Stephen Levitsky and Ziblatt about their recent Journal of Democracy article on this, actually on another podcast. And, it was a really interesting conversation. And one of the things that they're talking about in their piece, which I think is called When Should the Majority Rule, is, what is the risk of actually getting a constitution that is so well defended that you never change it and then it goes out of date, right? Then it is not enabling you to respond to some of the challenges that you're now facing. And so, one of the things they argue is that there are certain times when actually you need to allow the constitution to evolve and to reflect what is happening within society. And so the piece is a very interesting kind of discussion of, well, look, how do you then do that? How do you hold certain things, as it were, sacrosanct and not allow them to be changed or have a really high threshold for changing them, but enable the system to evolve and adapt in other ways by by having other parts of the system that, shall we say, have less high thresholds. So, you could need 2/3 in Parliament and a national referendum to change the Bill of Rights, but there could be a lower threshold for changing something else, which is not quite so central and might need to evolve over time. And I think that's a really interesting, good question, right? Because it plays into what we were talking about earlier, which is if we're actually going to have effective democracies in the future, they're going to have to respond to this challenge and evolve, and they're going to have to show people that they can be innovative, right? And that they can actually solve some of the challenges, whether that's through creating new ways for citizens to interface with the political system, or finding new ways, to design the political system in terms of, devolution of power. But, a lot of those might actually involve changes to the legal system and the constitution. And we don't want to end up in a situation where we're so constrained that we can't respond. So there is a really kind of delicate balance here between securing and institutionalizing those things that we worry could be subverted if an authoritarian came to power,
Yes, that's right.
whilst also enabling ourselves to be responsive and reflective and anticipate some of the challenges we might face in the future. That's a really big challenge, I think, and it's a tricky one.
Yeah, and I think established democracies like Canada may also be atrophying democracies as a result of some of the things that we just talked about. With regard to your book, How to Rig an Election, which when I saw, I did not. I guess this is volume 2. When you published volume 1 some years ago, is that right?
It's a sort of updated version, yeah.
Yeah, updated.
Unfortunately, rigging strategies update all the time. It's a kind of cat and mouse game, right? So the
Yeah,
people working out what they're doing, work it out, and we tell observers, and the observers know, and they develop new strategies. And as a community of people who care about this, we're trying to kind of develop better ways to defend elections. And of course, the autocrats know we're doing that, so they go and develop new strategies to rig them. And
yeah,
one of the best quotes I ever heard was from a kind of democracy activist in Africa. It was in, I think, Zimbabwe, who said to me at one point, it feels like we're always fighting the last election and trying to put it right, and they're always planning to rig the next one. In other words, we're always plugging the holes in the system, but they're actually out there with a hammer putting in new holes we don't even know
sure,
exist yet.
sure. Um, Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I just love the title, by the way, How to Rig an Election. When I saw that, it made me think that I should start doing work on how to sabotage a committee hearing, or really putting it out there rather than just talking about best practices, and see if we can get some traction on when it comes to public finance and effective democratic practices. The book emphasizes hacking the election through fake news and deep fakes. That seems to me to be a major threat to both established and budding democracies or emerging democracies. Can you talk a bit about how much of a threat that is to countries like the UK, for example?
I think this is a massive issue, right? And it applies in multiple ways. Just to take a step back for a second, we could be talking about hacking into voting machines. So we could be talking about hacking into email accounts. We know that, a lot of the voting machines that have been used around the world are not impervious to hacking. A lot of researchers, including at top US institutions, have gone and tried and managed to hack into them. So we have serious concerns about electoral security. One of the things we mentioned in the book is that it was not that long ago that most of the passwords, right, in certain election offices in the US for the computers was password, right? I mean, there was an audit done that revealed systematic failings of security. So we've got that side of it. Then we've got the disinformation side. Then we've got um, the use of AI and deep fakes and so on. And all of these are major challenges that I don't think we as democratic states are investing enough to try and prevent and stop. And the ways to prevent that and stop that, it's very difficult. It's obviously investing in cybersecurity and making sure that you have the best possible protections for your electoral data. But it's also then about having to actually have regulations that manage social media and make sure that fake news is taken down quickly, that disinformation is dealt with, that ethnic hate speech and so on is targeted and removed. I do a lot of my research in a part of the world of sub-Saharan Africa where one of the things people worry about the most around elections is ethnic tensions and the potential for clashes between communities if the elections are disputed. So in this context, lying about the quality of the elections or putting out information about what different leaders have said about other communities or what's happening
Could be
can
lethal.
really be
Hmm.
dangerous. You could have a
Hmm.
fake news message that there was a massacre of a certain community by another community, one part of the country, that actually turns out not to have happened.
Right.
But by putting that out there, you ramp up the tensions, you create the possibility of revenge attacks. And one of the things that I felt was happening a few years ago, having talked to people like Facebook and Twitter in places like Nairobi and elsewhere, was that this was being dealt with, more money was being invested, more was being done. And then, of course, we've seen a really big shift since Musk took over Twitter, but also in terms of Facebook policy, including after Trump got into power, where there is far less. A lot of the offices have been closed down. Obviously, a lot of people know about the downsizing and the removal of staff. So there is a lot less effort going into this. Now, we see some regions responding. Of course, European Union has moved to have tighter regulation on social media. But a lot of countries around the world don't have that. And of course, it's much more difficult if you're an isolated country than if you have a big economic bloc like the European Union to be able to work together on this. So I think that is one of the things that, again, really concerns me moving forwards, that we're not treating this as, again, an existential threat to our democratic existence. We're tinkering around the edges with disinformation and hate speech at a time when actually it's causing massive problems. And in the UK, it's interesting to me. I mean, we had a situation in the UK, or have had situations where we've had disinformation and hatred used in the context of uh, treatment of asylum seekers and the
Oh,
housing of
yep.
asylum
I
seekers
remember
in
hearing about that
hotels.
recently. Yep.
We've also had an MP killed, right, in the UK um, in recent memory. And so, and of course, in the United States, you've had also political violence of similar kinds. But have we actually seen in the UK a concerted cross-party decision to say, okay, this has gone too far, we now need to come together? No, actually, in the UK, these things have been turned into a political football. So the parties of the right are actually claiming that some of the attempts to stop this from happening, for example, by arresting people who put inflammatory messages, are illegitimate and censorship. There was even a suggestion, I think, in the newspaper today that the country had become North Korea as a result. Now, I'm not saying that every time somebody's, arrested for something, I fully agree with the decision of the police. Of
Yep.
course not. There are lots of, it's a very difficult situation, and it's very hard to sort of draw the line of when someone has gone beyond, when something has gone beyond what is legitimate and acceptable to say in the context of free speech online. But the fact that we don't have a responsible adult conversation between the main parties where they come together and actually form an understanding of how we're going to deal with this and back each other up is really worrying, because of course it panders to and plays to the more extremist parties who are going to take advantage of this. And so I do worry that, there's remarkably little being done about something that is actually making it not just harder to build an effective democracy, but harder to govern. right? Harder for government to actually pass good policies and get those policies implemented, because citizens are becoming citizens are becoming less willing to do what governments want, partly as a result of the information that they're getting online. And it's a challenging one, right? Because I work in a lot of countries where one of the biggest challenges for democracy and opposition groups in the world in their history has been censorship. And so
Hmm.
many of the countries, the last thing that opposition activists and civil society groups want to do is shut down the internet or have high levels of censorship. They
Sure.
know that actually this has democratized information in a way that's really important. So it's not about turning the clock back. It's not about saying we should go back to state controlled information. That is absolutely not the answer. But you should be able to have a free online space without people being able to make up really politically damaging lies on a regular basis that twist information and increase the risk of people being attacked physically. And we need to find a way of responding better to that.
Last question, because I know you have to run. You conclude in How to Rig an Election that defending democracy is a prolonged, iterative process. What gives you hope for a democratic resurgence?
I think one of the things that we need to say, going back to a previous conversation we were having just a minute ago about elections and when do you go beyond the point of no return, is that in a sense there is no point of no return. And that's what gives me hope. So think about Bangladesh, right? Bangladesh, we went into an election that we knew was going to be manipulated. It was going to be heavily controlled. We had boycotts from opposition parties. It was not the election that was going to drive change in Bangladesh. It was people going to the streets. We have a lot of African countries where political institutions are weaker than they are, for example, in North America or Europe. But despite that, people have fought for and campaigned for democracy, sometimes through the ballot box, but also sometimes by going to the streets. And so there is still that ability for people power to push regimes back. I think that's happening right now, somewhere like Serbia, where people are doing that, led again in some cases by students and academics and others. I think that is one thing that really inspires me, that ultimately, in a lot of countries around the world, people will come out and they will fight, and that collective mass of people fighting for a better future and a more democratic future can actually push back authoritarians, even when it looks like a country has gone beyond the point of no return. And that gives me hope, even for countries where things are bleak right now, like Hungary, and beyond. And then more broadly, I also think that right now we're in a really tough moment. And one of the things I say to people when I feel like their morale is low and maybe they need to be rallied a little bit is, this is a really tough time. Democracy is not sexy. We are in a wave of authoritarianism, but this authoritarian moment itself will not last. Many of these governments will do a terrible job. Many of them will be corrupt. Many of them will be conflictual. Public opinion will then shift in recognition of this. You cannot use disinformation to persuade people that a government that is pushing them into poverty is actually doing a good job. And what we will see, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years, from the military juntas in West Africa to some of the more authoritarian regimes in Europe, is that they will also start to disappoint people as their democratic predecessors did. And as that happens, those leaders and those movements will no longer have the edge. They will no longer be trending and be able to be the ones who are actually winning on social media and more likely to go viral. We may return in some ways to a moment like the 1990s when actually the energy globally is in favor of resistance and revolution and rebellion against exactly those types of movements that are taking power now. And so one of the things I say to people is, even if you don't think you can win today, we must fight today so that we can win in 10, 15, 20 years' time. We must be ready for that swing of the pendulum that comes back towards us on the democracy side. And it will come. And if we do the things that we've been talking about, we'll be in a better place to take advantage of it.
Wow. So inspiring to talk to you. And Nic Cheeseman, professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Great pleasure, Geoff. Let's do it again soon.
We'll hope so. Thank you.
Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.